Hi everyone, my name is Sam Sadeghi and I serve as president of the Iranian Law Students Association here at UCLA. We're really thankful for all of you to show up and come. We're really excited about this event. As you know, we're having Professor John Tehranian from Southwestern Law School and Professor Sohail Daulatzai from UC Irvine. And then we have Maytha Alhassen, who has graciously agreed to be on the panel as well. She comes from USC. She will introduce the speakers' bios shortly. Before she does that, I just wanted to let you know that Professor Daulatzai has his book that he wrote. It's called Black Star Crescent Moon, The Muslim International and Black Freedom Beyond America. And he does have those here for sale if you're interested in buying them. They'll be available after the event. And Professor Tehranian's book, which most of this talk today will be based off of, is called Whitewashed, America's Invisible Middle Eastern Minority. He doesn't have paper copies available, but you can always purchase it on Kindle or Amazon. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to the panel, and just thanks again for coming. Oh, also, before I forget, the Critical Race Studies program and the Iranian Law Students Association partnered to bring this event to you, and we're also thankful for the co-sponsorships that we have received, and we received several, and just so I don't leave anyone out, let me pull it up. We're really thankful for the co-sponsorship of Asian Pacific Islander Law Students Association, the Black Law Students Association, Raza, Muslim Law Students Association, the Native American Law Students Association, and the South Asian Law Students Association. So this is really a collaborative effort, and it's a topic that affects all of our communities, and so we're really interested to hear the experts speak on it. Thanks again.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for warmly welcoming Trojan into your environment. First things first, most importantly, I thought that we could introduce a hashtag, and I authoritarianly decided that we should probably do UCLA Law Post-9/11, Post-9/11. Is that good? So just tweet anything that you find interesting or any questions under that hashtag, UCLA Law Post-9/11. Okay, I'm going to go into the bios. John Tehranian is an academic, attorney, and author with a focus on entertainment law, intellectual property, and civil rights. He's an Irwin R. Buchalter? Okay, good. My ESL paid off. Professor of Law at Southwestern Law School and the Buchalter Entertainment and Media Law Institute in Los Angeles, California. And of course, you have some books, 2 books, Infringement Nation, Copyright 2.0 and You, and a book that you have today, Whitewashed, America's Invisible Middle Eastern Minority. And to my left is Sohail Daulatzai. No? Wrong. Okay. Is the author of 3 books, including Black Star Crescent Moon, The Muslim International, which we have for sale today, and Black Freedom Beyond America, and, sorry, those weren't said correctly. The Muslim International and Black Freedom Beyond America, and Born to Use Mics, Reading Naz's Ilmatic. He's the curator of the exhibit Return of the Mecca, The Art of Islam and Hip Hop, and the editor of the limited edition companion commemorative book of the same name, which includes an interview with Yassine Bey, also known as Most Def, an essay by Ph.D., as well as an album cover art, photography, flyers, and other ephemera. He's also associate professor in the Department of Film and Media Studies and in the program in African American Studies at University of California, Irvine. So let me introduce this topic, say a couple of words, and also impart a couple of questions as we think through what it means to talk about racialization of South Asians and Middle Easterners post-9/11. First of all, why is this pertinent now? I'm going to read a tweet by the Arab American activist Linda Sarsour that was tweeted on February 10th. She said, "We did it. Because of you, we will have a new category, Middle Eastern North African, in the 2020 census. So this was a landmark moment because previous to that, Middle Easterners as a category did not exist on the census. Anybody including that category was defined as, does anybody know? White, precisely, Caucasian, white. So they went through a process of submitting, I believe, 5,000 positive letters, and the Office of Management and Budget is going to review the possibility of the category in 2020. So the question is then how Middle Easterners and anybody included in that category became white. What is the history of that? What does the post-9/11 moment mean for Middle Easterners and South Asians? Was it a rupture point? Was it a changing topography of racial identities? What does it mean in terms of national security and civil liberties? How can we think about that triangulation? So to go through the history and the theoretics, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters.
Should go up here, I guess. Well, I don't have a PowerPoint. This is John, very professional looking. I just got some notes jotted down on an iPad. So first of all, I want to thank you all for coming here. I'm sure it was a free lunch that attracted all of you guys here to come and hear us talk. And also to the organizers, Asla Bali, I know is not here, so I want to thank her for coming, both to May and John. It's a pleasure to be here. And what, I think is a very important set of questions and ideas, especially for you all as emerging, or shall I say, burgeoning law students in the field, who are having to think about some of these questions that are kind of, as I'm going to argue in many ways, haunting kind of U.S. nation-state formation, right? Like, what does that mean? And when we talk about race and Muslims, or I should say South Asian and Middle Eastern communities, we talk about it in those ways, right? It's important to think about this through a kind of historical lens as well. So what I want to do is kind of paint a kind of broad brushstroke, and then hopefully throw out maybe some provocations that maybe we can answer in the Q&A. But I want us to think about, maybe in broad brushstrokes, some of the historical basis for what's happening today. Now, one of the very simple things that often happens when we think about the question of racism and Muslims, when those two words get thrown around, most people often say, well, wait a minute, we're not talking about, that's religion, right? We're not talking about people, we're talking about the religion, Islam. The problem is Islam, right? And so therefore it's not racism, right? We tend to have this kind of knee-jerk reaction. And of course, if we understand the history of the modern concept of race, we understand that this idea of Islam, and then of course, the Muslims who are seen as followers of Islam, and as we'll talk about, even those who are, thought to be Muslims, i.e. Sikhs, who were subject to all kinds of racial violence, right? Palestinian Christians, a whole host of Christians and other kinds of groups who come out of the Middle East, South Asian region, have been kind of painted with, or smeared with, for lack of a better word, the brush of being Muslim, right? So we have to kind of tend to think about this category of Muslim or Islam in much more broader terms, because obviously you just have to look the part in order to be seen as or perceived as Muslim. And in many ways, it's literally a life or death phenomenon, right? Life or death is at stake in those kinds of moments. So I think, though, what has happened when we think about this question of race and Muslims is there has been a kind of, common term that's been thrown around to talk about this idea, and that is Islamophobia, right? We hear about Islamophobia all the time. And the term has kind of garnered a certain kind of traction and purchase, right, in kind of both mainstream and even academic and activist spaces. You hear about Islamophobia. And what I want to try and do maybe is push back on that term a little bit, because I think when we talk about Islamophobia, we're talking about something that I think misses the boat. We tend to think of phobias as fear of the dark or fear of spiders, right, arachnophobia, right, fear of heights, right, these phobias that we have. And phobias tend to be individual. There tends to be something psychologically kind of not wrong with the person who has the phobia, but they're kind of they have an issue, a personal issue with this thing called X, spiders, the dark, or maybe this thing called Islam. And so I think when we hear the term Islamophobia, to me, it misses the point because it reduces something systemic and structural, right, to the individual, right? All one has to do is get to meet a Muslim. And we have a lot of Muslim groups and communities who that's their approach toward activism. Let's just introduce ourselves to people. Let people meet us. Most of the people who say this stuff about Muslims have never met a Muslim, right? This is the kind of conversation that tends to get had. Or maybe even read the Quran, right? Not that anybody's reading a book today, but get things like, well, then get to know Islam. Maybe you'll get over your Islamophobia. So I think when we talk about Islamophobia, we miss the boat on what I think we should be terming anti-Muslim racism, right? We have to understand what's called Islamophobia within the context of white supremacy, right? We have to understand this in the context of white supremacy as a structuring logic, right? A way of race making. And I'm going to throw some words out there that I think we'll come back to. A way of race making, a form of race thinking, right? And for those of us who understand, I know in a law school context, even in the law school context, we can see how the law becomes a vehicle or a symbol for a way of looking at the way in which white supremacy changes and shifts over time, right? Now, I'm sitting here in kind of like, the center, the epicenter of critical race studies. And of course, Cheryl Harris's work, Whiteness as Property, becomes kind of foundational in terms of thinking about this, right? So what I want us to think about is how white supremacy as a structuring logic is eminently interested in preserving white life. That even when we talk about security narratives, right, securitization, I'm going to come back to this idea, it's eminently about preserving whiteness and white life, right? So that's what white supremacy is eminently interested in. So when we think about white supremacy, we're thinking about the way in which it protects and maintains white life, white property, white value, whiteness, right? Now, how did this come to be? Here's where I'm going to do kind of like the historical thing. I'm not a historian by trade, so if there's any historians in the room, they're probably going to be like, getting ready to throw something at me. But when we think about this historically, how many people have heard of Edward Said? Right? Okay, good. It's not Ed said, Edward Said. There's a great t-shirt that says, I agree with what Ed said. Right? So Edward Said wrote this kind of landmark text called Orientalism. Right? For those of you who don't know it, but in it he talks about the European encounter in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries with what he's referring to as the Orient, right? What we now refer to as the quote-unquote Middle East, which is really West Asia, right? South Asia, right? The kind of North Africa, the Muslim, right? Like the encounter between the European and the Muslim. And of course, Said kind of begins to kind of trace this relationship, right? But what he and others, Daulatzai, Gil Andajar and a whole host of other scholars and philosophers uncovered was that when we go back to the very foundation of this thing called race, right? Where does it emerge from? The modern concept of race emerges out of this relationship of Europe to the non-European, right? And where does that emerge, right? We all grew up with that kind of fairy or the kind of lullaby, right? Or a song that we used to sing in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? We hear this, we grew up with it. And what we don't make the connection with oftentimes is that the celebration of Columbus and the national holiday of Columbus and his exploring and finding the new world, right, happened at the same time that the figure of the Moor was in many ways eviscerated or ejected from Europe. That is to say, at the very heart of the modern concept of race and white supremacy sits the Moor, right? The Moor is ejected from Europe. Europe defines itself as the white and the Christian, right? And so we have to understand that the very foundation of this modern concept of race is the black and the Muslim, right? This became the way in which even when the Spanish were here on this continent and the genocide here began, they read First Nations and indigenous people through the lens of Muslims. They would call them Musulman. They had no other way of understanding the non-Christian. They had no other way of understanding what they referred to as the heathen other than the Muslim, right? So the very idea of otherness in relationship to the normative whiteness is the Muslim, is what I'm trying to suggest. And Said's Orientalism built upon this idea of how Orientalism was a discourse about race. It was a discourse of otherness in relationship to the European, the white European, right? So Said, for those of us who know, and very quickly, kind of argued that in defining this kind of quintessential, eternal, essentialized Oriental or Muslim as savage, violent, backward, right? These are all racializing terms, right? Europe was able to define itself. Whiteness was able to define itself as its exact opposite, right? So this is how kind of race making works, right? So Orientalism set up this idea that within Europe and liberal humanist philosophy, right, the idea of otherness and was predicated upon the Orient, right? The excommunication from the idea of the human. So that even then, lawmaking, or the idea of the law, was about constructing who was human and who was not, who was subject to the law and its protections, and who was to be punished by the law, right? And there were two different categories, one for the European, one for the non-European, right? So I lay out this kind of very brief historical backdrop to give you a sense that when it comes to racialization in the United States, clearly the United States is in many ways the child of Europe, right? Birthed by Europe. It kind of owes its kind of liberalist and political legacy to the idea of Europe, although it tries to always in some way see itself as somewhat different, right? It's not based on bloodlines and royalty and hierarchy, it's about the individual and the common man. We can get into that as well. But the United States, in many ways, has its own somewhat distinct idea around race and Muslims. And that comes out of the work I did in my book, which has to do with blackness, right? When we think about the United States context and we think about its relationship to Islam and Muslims, it comes primarily through the lens of blackness. Scholars have done this work. Up to 30, maybe even 40% of the Africans brought here and made to be slaves were Muslim, right? There's then this kind of history of black Islam in this country. Of course, Malcolm X becomes this kind of paradigmatic figure, right? The whole conversion narrative of the name change is about resisting kind of whiteness and white supremacy, right? So blackness becomes the kind of lens to understand and view and then racialize Islam and Muslims in a U.S. context, right? And we can begin to talk about and think about the fear of this within, the United States. Of course, when Obama was running for president, the whole fear is his middle name is Hussein and his last name rhymes with Osama, and so therefore somehow he's a Muslim. He might be a Muslim, right? And of course, in many ways, that's what I argued in the book was a deeper anxiety over the legacy of a figure like Malcolm. This history of blackness in Islam is in many ways kind of haunted the U.S. So when we think about Islam and Muslims, and we think about racialization, I want us to be able to think about both historically, right, emanating out of a European context, but even in a more contemporary frame with the emerging U.S. empire that borrows heavily from Orientalist logic, right? So you still see, for example, in U.S. statecraft, for example, the philosophical blueprint for the torture, right, memos, and the way in which the U.S. was kind of creating security logic in Afghanistan and Iraq was Raphael Patai's book, The Arab Mind, a 1973 book by an Israeli anthropologist that was deeply racist and Orientalist, right? And it comes out of this tradition of Orientalism that Said was talking about. And this became the foundation and blueprint for U.S. statecraft in dealing with the Muslim, right? And I know John's going to get into some of the more kind of nitty-gritty details about maybe case law and the history of kind of citizenship appeals and how we can begin to think about how that helps us understand better racialization. But I want to, in setting this up, and again, I'm just trying to throw out provocations. How many times do I have left there?
We have 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay, perfect. I say that because I know what I'm doing. 2 minutes. All right. But when we think about, this in a very contemporary moment, I want us to also then begin to think about, right, how the war on terror and what that means, right, for understanding race. As I mentioned before, right, I think it's important for us to think about the language of terror and terrorism. As I'm arguing in some of my new work, right, in many ways, it's the 21st century way of saying savage, right? To call someone a terrorist, to use the word terror, is about excommunicating one from the political community of the West, of liberalism, right? So that the frame of terror and terrorism becomes a racializing discourse. Right? It's a racializing term, right? And it's much like, for example, during the post-civil rights moment with the war on crime, right? You heard the term about the criminal. Well, who's a criminal? In our country, in this country, right, as it's referred to, the racializing logic around what criminal is has become equated with blackness, You think criminal, you think blackness. That's the kind of racializing logic, right? You don't think about men in suits or judges with robes or men who hold office. You don't think about those as criminals, right? Or you don't even think about white-collar crime. You think about street-level crime and the dangerous black thug, right? The criminal has become racialized in a particular way, right? So has the category illegal when it comes to immigration, right? The war on the immigration debate, there's illegals, and then there's this whole term around, and illegal becomes a very kind of racializing term. What I'm arguing is that terror does too. It becomes a racializing logic that's about excommunicating particular ideas, particular activities, and particular groups of people from a political community. And I'll close on this, it has deep kind of political import. Because as we all know, to be labeled a terrorist, right, that's a legal and political category. All manner and means of sanction by the state can come down on you. That then justifies a country being droned, sanctioned, an individual being tortured or killed, right? Just by simply the label. And we begin to see how fuzzy the label is when Iran and Hezbollah go from being on the so-called terrorist list to all of a sudden be off the terrorist list, right? So we start to see how this is really about a political, this is political gamesmanship, who and what is a terrorist. But in the logic of the war on terror, and the security logic of the war on terror, to me, the language of terrorism has become a racializing discourse, right? And I'm going to close on this, right? That too often the move is made, and we can begin to see, right, when a white person goes and shoots up a school or flies a plane into the IRS building in Texas or, downs a plane in Germany or whatever, right? The knee-jerk response by many Muslims is, well, he's a terrorist too. See, not just Muslims are terrorists, there's white terrorists too, right? That becomes the kind of knee-jerk response. And we see that very rarely is a white person who does these kinds of activities actually labeled a terrorist. It's rare, right? Which begins to then maybe pose some questions to us about, well, wait a minute, what's this about? Why does the idea of terror or terrorism not apply to white bodies? And when it does, it's very selective and rare, right? And what I'm saying is that knee-jerk response about saying, well, white people are terrorists too, I'm concerned, normalizes the logic of terrorism. It says then, there's this thing called terrorism that's out there, it exists, and the state now has to go and protect us, right? It kind of reinvigorates the security logic that to me is about maintaining white supremacy, right? And so I think we have to be resistant to that because as we know, now again, I keep on saying I'm going to close on this, but I am going to close on this. When we talk about prosecution around those labeled terrorists, right? Even if we have whites labeled as terrorists, we know just like when it comes to whites who are criminals or whites who are illegal, like there's a tremendous amount of whites who come from Canada who are undocumented, right? They're not going to be persecuted or prosecuted in the same way that the black and brown people who are labeled criminal or illegals are going to be prosecuted. There's a very, sharp divide in terms of differential kinds of prosecution and sentencing that goes for whites who are called criminal and whites who are called illegals. And what I'm suggesting to you is the same thing goes with the language of terror. Even if we call a white person a terrorist, we know that the state is still going to target non-whites as the primary and dominant kind of source of what's called terrorism. It's, again, a racializing discourse. So I'll close on this and pass the mic over to John. But, I appreciate you guys for the time, and hopefully we'll pick this up during the Q&A. All right? Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming out to this talk, and also I wanted to thank everyone for the invitation, Asla, obviously, Jesseline, and Sam and Sarah in particular for the invite. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to go in a slightly different order than I originally planned. I kind of want to build, I think it's more exciting to build on what Sohail specifically mentioned during his talk. And, it provoked a lot of interesting points. And, for example, you just mentioned one of the recent events involving the German pilots, right, who drove the plane into the mountain. And of course, if you look at the narrative surrounding that, right, no one's billing him a terrorist. Instead, we're delving into his mental health history, which is such a unfortunate, classic example of how someone who is white who commits a heinous act of arguably terrorism involving mass killing is treated as opposed to someone who is not white is treated. The white person is kind of an an outlier. They're not treated as this is a crime against their race or as someone who is racialized in any particular way. Instead, we delve into them as an outlier because they must have mental health problems. I'm pretty sure all the other people who have, engaged in absolutely heinous acts against civilians have mental health problems also. But we don't talk about that because that would then suggest that they're an individual outlier. They're not a representative member of their race. Instead, the individuals who commit these crimes are racialized. We talk about them because of their Muslim identity or their Middle Eastern identity. And I think that's an unfortunate tendency that's been played out again and again. So, I'm gonna kind of skip around a little bit and talk a bit about how I came to this topic and talk a little bit about the process of selective racialization or selective colorblindness that we're seeing in the law currently play out, especially post 9/11, and how this process of selective colorblindness has effectively helped achieve a continued perpetuation of white geographies, kind of a reemphasis of spaces where white identity is privileged, where white supremacy is perpetuated. And looking particularly at some of the events in recent years. So I'm going to skip over some of this stuff. I'll get back to that later. But this is a lovely little poster that hangs in a barbecue joint called Non-Mockers. It's a little barbecue joint outside of Dallas in Texas. It became a news headline a few years ago, very briefly. And the poster says, "Let's play cowboys and Iranians." And what it draws upon in this barbecue joint is the traditional old Southern lynching narrative of yore, except it's been updated to a more modern context. It's no longer particularly acceptable to show black people getting lynched. That would be billed as racist. And so what's happened is instead we show someone who is deemed the enemy today, an Iranian, being lynched. We have a group of white individuals who were dressed in cowboy hats, and at the top there you see someone in stereotypically Middle Eastern garb, certainly not Iranian garb, dressed and being hung. The guy on the left has a t-shirt that says "Iranians suck." There were a few protests involving this guy's poster, but it still proudly hangs. And here's what the owner said about it. "This is still America. If they're not happy here, then they should go back to Iran. It's my choice to have it up. It's your choice to go where you want to go." Now I posit this is not just an affront to Iranian Americans, not just an affront to Middle Eastern Americans. What it suggests is the narrative that we have going on about race in our society, especially post 9/11, is actually an affront to anyone who doesn't fit in to the traditional white male archetype. It's a narrative that's an affront to anybody who's different, of any other color. Someone who is, for example, of an alternative sexual orientation walks into this place. They know they're not welcome. Someone who is black knows they're not welcome, even though it's technically just an attack against an Iranian. And I think that's important to remember because the subject we're discussing here in terms of racialization of Middle Easterners and South Asians shouldn't just be of interest to Middle Easterners and South Asians. It's something that directly links to a historical narrative of the white and the other. And building on something Sohail mentioned, in terms of the history of conflating race and religion, one of the fascinating things about our own history in the United States and the legacy of slavery is originally slavery was not necessarily deemed as a sort of white-black divide issue where it was the black people that were enslaved. It did happen to be black people that were enslaved, but it was partly sort of determined not just on color, skin color grounds, but the idea was it was the whites and the heathens being individuals who were non-Christian. And in fact, in the early days of slavery in the United States, if you were black but you were non-Christian presumably, and you converted to Christianity, that was a way of becoming a free, emancipated individual. So in fact, in the early days of American slavery, it was all about being non-Christian. What happened was that loophole was closed by law. Several statutes were passed as people began to notice that, well, not surprisingly, people suddenly found Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior and suddenly found themselves subject to emancipation. Obviously, the Southerners didn't like that, so they started closing the loophole, and they said, well, you can't get out of slavery by converting from Islam or from some other quote-unquote pagan religion into Christianity. And so that loophole was closed. Talking about recent headlines, we have this individual who you all recognize, okay? And a fascinating issue emerged that ties in the issue of race, religion, and its conflation. There was much surprise in the popular media when the perpetrators of the Boston Massacre turned out to be people that maybe were white, but they were Muslim, and people were confused. How could these people be white and Muslim at the same time? And one of the more fascinating studies that came out of this was a study done by a professor at the Kellogg School and a doctoral student at Harvard University that looked at perceptions of the brothers and their whiteness, and noticed a very strong correlation between how people perceived the brothers as white and how they felt about whether they should be given leniency, or in particular this brother, leniency in terms of how they are treated under the criminal justice system. The perception of his whiteness was directly linked to feelings about punishing him. The study found that the less white individuals perceived Jostar Tsarnaev, the more willing they were to punish him severely. Or the more willing they were to punish him severely. So when we talk about sort of the post-Obama, colorblind racial narrative, we see the relevance of race continues to resonate, whether it's when we're playing cowboys and Iranians and saying, well, that's an exception to racism there. We're just fighting an enemy, a scourge of radical Islam, where it comes to perceptions of whiteness in the criminal justice system. And you see this played out, as Sohail mentioned, with respect to the racialization of the leader of our country, Barack Obama. And I think the narrative surrounding his race has been, epitomizes the new narrative on race. It's no longer acceptable to attack someone on grounds that they are black. That's not popularly acceptable. Does it happen? Of course it happens. But it's not allowed in polite company. So no longer do we have this. Willie Horton, some of you may remember in 1988, a famous ad brought by the Republican National Committee attacking Michael Dukakis, who was the presidential candidate at the time, showing this menacing figure of an African American who he had released on a furlough program, who went out on a crime spree. And it was this ad that really is credited for turning around Dukakis' 30-point lead over George Bush Sr. Because what the strategy, as the Republican masterminds behind the ad later on admitted, was simply to bring the image of a quote-unquote menacing African-American individual into the homes of the good white people who were going to vote, and suggest that Michael Dukakis was going to bring this guy into your house. So we no longer have ads that are acceptable on those grounds. But if you look at the narrative that surrounded Barack Obama during his presidency runs in 2008 and 2012, you had attacks on him, not for his blackness explicitly, because that's not polite and allowed. You had attacks on him because of his otherness, through the guise of his maybe Middle Easternness. So we have the Drudge Report carrying that photo around and showing it with him dressed in what looks to be Middle Eastern garb that created people hesitated. You had Sarah Palin talking about him palling around with terrorists, implying that he is not an American, he's more with the others. You had a woman on the campaign trail talking to John McCain saying, I don't trust Obama because he's an Arab. And McCain, God bless him, I don't think he meant this, but look what he said. No, man, he's a decent family man, citizen. Implicating basically, no, he's not Arab, because Arabs, of course, we know are not decent, but no, he's a decent man. Okay? You had Hillary Clinton in an interview talking about Obama's religion, and she says, he's not Muslim, and then pauses with this pregnant pause. As far as I know. Leading people to wonder. You had the photos of Obama in the turban. You had the ads by the Republican Trust talking about his support for driving licenses with illegal immigrants and helping empower jihadists who perpetrated 9/11. And then, of course, you had Mitt Romney in a classic comment saying, no one's asked to see my birth certificate. A comment that is, of course, loaded because where did Mitt Romney's grandfather come from? Mexico. Well, why don't we ask him to see his birth certificate? Where was John McCain born? Panama Canal. Why don't we ask to see his birth certificate and ask questions? There is no discourse about those individuals not being fit to run for the presidency, and yet, despite the disclosure of Obama's birth certificate, large numbers of Americans continue to believe that Barack Obama was not born in the United States, and also continue to believe that he is, in fact, a Muslim. So what are we to make of all this? Well, you have a very interesting trend happening in the law. On one hand, you have this discourse of color blindness. People, of course, like to point out that, well, Barack Obama was elected president. Obviously, we're post-racial. We're not racist in a racist country anymore. We have elected an African Americans to presidents. And you have a Gallup poll showing that 78% of white Americans feel that blacks are now treated equally with whites. Okay? And a fascinating study that showed that on average, white Americans actually view anti-white bias as more prevalent in our country now than anti-black bias. That's a remarkable position. Only 38% of white Americans believe that racism is still a significant problem. And 65% believe that there is little difference between the economic and social conditions of whites and blacks. That is demonstrably, shockingly untrue, as the people in this room know. And the legal discourse has adopted this philosophy. You basically have Justice Scalia in his attacks on affirmative action talking about how we got to be post-racial because in the eyes of the government we're just one race, American. Okay? And you have the recent dismantling of the Voting Rights Act for the Supreme Court. And the rationale for it, Justice Roberts writing in Shelby County v. Holder, 2013. This country has changed and the Voting Rights Act is based on 40-year-old facts having no logical relationship to the present day. You have the dismantling of affirmative action on the grounds that we're a colorblind society. You have the cynical invocation of Plessy v. Ferguson as the basis for dismantling affirmative action programs. Well, that's all well and good if we want to be aspirational and say that color shouldn't matter and government should be considering color at all. Yet the reality is, there is a totally separate body of case law that's emerged and has been, in fact, amplified in recent years, where the government and courts, just like the court in Shelby County and just like Scalia, have actually been saying, well, in some instances, we still do need to consider color. What are those instances? They just so happen to be those instances where there is the targeting of people of Middle Eastern descent, the targeting of people of Asian descent, the targeting of people of Latino descent, and the targeting of people of African American descent. So where do we see that? Well, we see that in certain types of cases involving terrorism, courts have said, well, we're not entirely colorblind. It'd be ridiculous not to consider the color of someone's skin when deciding who to kick off an airplane. Individual who is Portuguese American, Mr. Cerqueira, sues for being kicked off of an American Airlines flight a few years back. Unequivocally kicked off because he had the misfortune, again for lack of a better word, of looking Middle Eastern. Pilot kicked him off because he looked Middle Eastern and suspicious. The but-for cause was he looked Middle Eastern. He sued. He won a jury verdict. Won $1 million for discrimination. Federal appellate court threw out the verdict. On what grounds? Well, you have to consider color when deciding who it might be a threat to safety on an airplane, the court said. What happened to color blindness? What happened to the eyes of the government? We are just one race. Apparently, we aren't one race. We're only one race when we're trying to dismantle the structure of affirmative action, a program that's been around for 40 years to make up for 500 years of systemic discrimination against individuals who are non-white. But if it comes to deciding who's inimical to safety on an airplane, all of a sudden, we're allowed to consider race. What about police checkpoints? Supreme Court, in a case called Wren, says, well, you know, someone's African-American identity, it might be relevant to considering criminality. So that's allowable at criminal stop points. What about immigration? Well, even internal immigration stops in the U.S., courts have carved an exception under a case called Brignani-Ponce, which basically says that, of course, you can consider someone's Asian identity, their Latino identity, their Middle Eastern identity, in terms of subjecting them to random stops based on race. This all ties in, of course, to the Show Me Your Papers provision in Arizona, which was passed a couple of years ago, that requires individuals to have to prove their their right to be in this country. And the proponents of this act said, well, it's not racial profiling because the act actually says that you can't engage in racial profiling in any way that's inconsistent with the United States Constitution. And that's true. That is what the text of the act says. The little catch there is, as the Supreme Court has interpreted the U.S. Constitution, you can consider race when deciding if someone is in fact not supposed to be in this country. The upshot of that is there has been a series of cases that actually have emerged out of a security checkpoint, immigration checkpoint, in Havre, Montana, just a few miles from the Canadian border. There have been two cases that emerged, one a Latino guy, one a Middle Eastern guy, both of whom were basically racially profiled at the checkpoint to be kicked out of the country for not belonging in the country. They sued, claiming violation of their civil rights. Court said, well, no, if you're Latino or you're Middle Eastern, you look unusual in Montana. So it's perfectly reasonable to subject you to a check. Perfectly reasonable to consider your race. Hey, what happened to color blindness? I thought we were post-racial. The irony there, where is Harbor, Montana? 20 miles from the Canadian border. Who's likely to be the illegal immigrant there? Probably a white Canadian. That didn't bother the court at all. And what's interesting is that basically sets up a white geography. What it means that individuals who look non-white and are trolling around in white places are going to be subject to heightened scrutiny. They're not going to have the same rights as individuals who are white. So, I think my time has run out and I'm way over time. All right, I'm going to leave it with that. I'd love to get into some more discussion in terms of the history of racialization, how Middle Easterners became white, and all of that, and I'm happy to open up the discussion and actually talk to May and have her ask some questions and we can get into some of this. So, thank you.
Thank you. So time check, in the interest of time, we have roughly about 15 minutes, and I'm just going to take the first couple of those 15 minutes to throw out some questions to the panel. I was trying to decipher whether or not I should do one, but I just want to have more time for audience participation. So some things came up, and one was this idea of the logic of terrorism or the terrorists in this post-9/11 moment. So the question is, how is that different than pre-9/11? So for example, in the Intifada era, in the 80s, we had Palestinians portrayed as terrorists, and there were popular films like Delta Force that portrayed the Palestinians as terrorists and the hijacker. And another thought around that, as we're talking about how Arabs, Middle Easterners, Iranians, and South Asians are racialized in the same way or possibly different ways, which I'd love you to go into as well. What does it mean to be white in post-9/11 moment, right? I think you, John, kind of went into what that looks like for somebody who is perceived as the white Muslim. So this also made me think about 4 kind of figures that I'd like us to tease out in relation to what you've talked about, the race making of white supremacy, how that sort of logic is structured. I wonder how we think about the Palestinian Christian, you brought that up, Sohail, the white Muslim again, the Sikh, and the black Muslim. Do those intersect? If the Palestinian Christian is Christian and the conflation of religion is so important, why is an American on the side of the Palestinian Christian? Again, why is the Sikh's religion that of the heathen? Why can't the Sikh exist in this in-between space? Why is the Sikh probably categorized as the Muslim? Why can the white person kind of transcend the stigma around Muslim? And really, I don't know if we got into much, what does all this mean for the black Muslim? So that's a lot.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. So pre-9/11, clearly pre-9/11 the language of terrorism emerged. I mean, when I talk about it in the book, the early 70s is when the United States really, like Remy Bruin has done some really good work on this. Pre-9/11, post civil rights, early 70s is when you begin to see the merging in the United States within mainstream popular discourse of the terrorists, right? And this is dovetailing quite nicely with increasing U.S. presence within post-67 Israel-Palestinian conflict, right? Of course, the 70s, you see that, you see the OPEC oil embargo, you see the deepening, you see the Iran hostage crisis pop off, you see U.S. and Afghanistan, you see its relationship with Iraq. I mean, the 70s become this kind of really formative moment for thinking about how this figure of the terrorist emerges within U.S. statecraft. And as I argue in my book, it dovetails quite nicely domestically with the emergence of the black criminal. So you have the black criminal and the Muslim terrorist kind of playing off of each other post-1970s. So, as May mentioned, from the 70s into the 80s, you see this figure continually emerge. And I mean, I'm in many ways the kind of living embodiment of this. The we're not cowboys, we're Iranians was something that I lived through, even though I'm not from Iran. right? Like come Iran hostage crisis, like there was all kinds of stuff that we had to endure as a family and not me as an individual because I was perceived to be Iranian, right? And then of course we get to the 1990s with Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis, right? The West versus the rest. The last war after the Cold War, in order for capitalism and democracy to kind of claim victory, is against Islam, right? So Huntington's thesis in the 1990s, in many ways, is the kind of signal moment that kind of springboards us into the post-9/11 context. So clearly, the figure of the terrorist existed before. But what I'm arguing is that post-9/11, it became in many ways institutionally codified through the legal, political, and even military mechanisms of the state, right? And so you can begin to see this and you know, kind of like pick off one part of May's question about what does it have to do with, you know, black Muslims or even non-Muslim black communities or even Latino communities here in the United States. You know, when we think about this securitizing logic, I mean, if you look at, for example, congressional testimony, Jeanette, you know, our lovely kind of head of the UC Regents now, right? When she was head of DHS, and Director of National Intelligence Michael McConnell testified in front of Congress in 2008 that at the U.S.-Mexico border, right, terrorists might come through. Hence, we need to securitize the border even more profoundly. Now, of course, this is not going to have much impact on Middle Eastern or South Asians coming through the border. Very few come through that border. It's going to have to do with Latinos who are trying to cross the border back and forth for, you know, a whole host of reasons, right? But again, they're using the language of terror to have more heavily militarized and securitized already the most militarized border in the world, right? I talk about this in my book. LAPD, for example, and local police departments have done incredibly due diligence in terms of like trying to be this local interface, particularly LAPD, between local policing and Department of Homeland Security, right? I talk about this in the last chapter of my book, how William Bratton from New York, then to LA, back to New York now, has been using the language of terrorism to further criminalize non-Muslim black and brown youth. Now, if you know anything about the Special Order 1s and 11s and Stop LAPD spying campaigns that have been taking off, like in LA, this is what's central to this logic. And this kind of relationship between local policing and the war on terror is the figure of the Muslim. So you have the NYPD in Tel Aviv with an office training back and forth between them and the IDF, right? You have U.S. military from Iraq and Afghanistan training here with the LAPD, and LAPD soldiers training with the U.S. military abroad, right? You just have recently, as of 2 months ago, Bratton in New York created what he called a strategic response group, a 350-man paramilitary anti-terrorism police unit in the NYPD to deal with what Bratton said were the recent protests over Ferguson and Eric Garner, what happened in Paris, and he referred to Mumbai from like 2009, I think, 2008, right? Maybe 2007, I forget the year exactly. So you have within the kind of formation of local police departments, right, the fear of the terrorist kind of shaping how they do policing that's impacting, of course, black Muslim and so-called immigrant Muslim communities, but more often non-Muslim black and brown communities. Again, the figure of the Muslim in many ways has become the lubricant to kind of reinvigorate the kind of white supremacist state logic, right, about security and protecting white life.
Yeah, so, and then to go around, especially like the Palestinian Christian, who I'm sure you can explain why that's ironic that somebody who is classified as white and then is Christian can probably not get the, you know.
Well, there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, the Palestinian Christian thing. Look, I mean, on one hand, you know, this ties into how we got racial categories and the fact that individuals of Middle Eastern descent are forcibly classified as white by law. The irony, of course, is we're not really treated as white by law. When I go to the airport, I'm not a white person going to the airport. No one's going to deem me white. My FBI file, if it exists, which I'm sure it does, doesn't say John Tehranian, white male. No. When the NYPD targets people on the basis of race, they do so because they're Middle Eastern and Muslim, not because they're a species of a white person. No. Right? And of course that ties into this idea that, again, the NYPD has been, in fact, as documents, declassified documents have shown, been targeting specifically based on Muslim and Middle Eastern racial identity. What happened to colorblindness? This is a state agency that is expressly acting on the basis of race, yet we keep on being told that we're a post-racial world. The Palestinian Christian, the reality is, in the popular imagination, we've been taught about the Middle East as a monolith. It's a monolith that exists only full of Muslim people, and not only just Muslim people, but radical, extreme Muslim people. The reality is it's much more nuanced than that. There are lots of historical populations that are non-Muslim in the Middle East, yet the average American doesn't know about that. The only time you find out about those people, actually in the popular press, is when it seems to fit some kind of strategic aim. So a few months ago, there was a story about those terrible attacks against some of the Iraqi Christians. And all of a sudden people learned, oh, there are Christians in Iraq. But it was really, you could see, as a basis to actually amp up American intervention in that region. And there was a sell job going on of showing Christian faces, who, by the way, seem to be selectively picked. A lot of the photos I saw showed the whitest Iraqis I've ever seen, right? And again, you could see it selling it, oh, look at these poor white Christians stuck in Iraq. Let's go help them. Let's go save them. The reality is most of the average American doesn't know that there are Palestinian Christians. To them, every Palestinian is Muslim and also a radical extreme Muslim. And so the idea of the Middle East as a Islamic monolith has served strategic policy goals in terms of foreign policy and has helped rationalize behavior. And the only time we get exceptions to that is when we need a change in the policy, where we suddenly find out about the other populations. Of course, the irony is that most of the Muslims in the world are non-Middle Eastern, and most Middle Easterners actually in the U.S., at least, are actually non-Muslim. No one knows that, except people in this room.
Well, I mean, I think I'll just pick up, and you know, one of the responses you heard from Middle Eastern South Asian communities after 9/11, after, you know, even if it was the most recent NYPD surveillance and spying campaign on the East Coast, whatever, was, why are they doing this to us? We're not criminals, right? We're not criminals, and you know, we have to ask the question, like, well, who's a criminal? Like, what does that mean? Like, are you really, what you're really saying is, we're not black, right? It's really about honorary whiteness, right? We're just good, law-abiding citizens, you know. And again, so that kind of a response misses a boat on a whole host of different issues and concerns. But what the main one is that it refuses to see how white supremacy is operating, right? It continues to play into this notion of honorary whiteness, right? That I think too many immigrant Muslim communities are invested in. And so this narrative of honorary whiteness continues to structure who we think we are. And I don't know how many different instances, court cases, instances of violence, murders, tortures, drones, invasions, do we need to hear and see before we realize we're not white.
Yeah,
we never
yeah, and I think that ties into some of the history, which we haven't got as much of a chance to discuss. But the reason Middle Easterners are defined as white by law is in part because Middle Easterners wanted to be defined by white as law. You talk to an average older Iranian American, and if you say they're not white, they get very angry and they go into a rant about how they're the original Aryans. Well, when you're delving into the racist ideology of Hitler and talking about being Aryan, that's usually not a good spot. There's a buying into the idea of white supremacy, and so many Arab Americans, many Iranian Americans, Turkish Americans have bought into the notion of whiteness and desperately cling on to whiteness. And I think it's come to be a harm, because the reality is when it comes down to an emergency, you're no longer white. You lose your whiteness pretty damn quickly. You're not going to be treated as white. So, and I think that's why it's useful for individuals of Middle Eastern descent to understand, critical race theory and to understand the struggles of other groups like Latino Americans, like African Americans, like Asian Americans, and understand that the problems facing the Middle Eastern and South Asian populations are very similar in many ways, and to kind of coordinate in terms of action.
Right. And before I open it up, I just want to add that there's always been a paradox of the social and legal racialized experience of the Middle Eastern and the South Asian community, because during this time when Syrians had petitioned for naturalization in the U.S. and done so through pleading their case of their admission into whiteness or their common sense logic that they are white, a couple of years after they won some of these cases, you heard cases of Syrians being lynched and KKK burning down their houses in the Jim Crow South. So there's always kind of been this paradox with these communities. So I'm going to open it up. I'm going to ask that all of you raise your hands, pose the question, and I'll take all the questions so that we can hear them, because we only have like probably 5 more minutes. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Me. Is your narrative contained only to geographical United States, or you're willing to open it up to global discussion?
Sure.
Any, yes.
Ooh, okay, I'm gonna try and spark note this the best possible, because we're kind of short on time. But I want to say, so I think I come from a space of now engaging in a lot of youth of color spaces, particularly around anti-oppression work, but particularly within Middle Eastern communities from various backgrounds and various communities. And one of the things that we constantly talked about is being able to organize on our own terms and outside of the white gaze. So when we're talking about terminology, I guess the question that I have for you all is, even a lot of the terminology that we use is really based in historical oppression or has very specific historical context. And also, if you all can speak to the fact that, many of us as immigrants have to navigate this hyphen of us being here in the United States, but also there are very real racialization processes back home for a lot of us. And so our homelands are very connected to that. And that it's not so easily, I think, taken from this context and just dropped at home. So I do think that that's a nuanced and important discussion that us internally constantly have between communities, but we're also always afraid, as you all said, in terms of appropriation or how that might be lending to some type of intervention in many ways.
This actually might be a very basic question, and for me, I'm realizing here at the law school too, it's so acceptable to use the identity of Muslim and Arab as reason for suspicion, which is clear, but it's I think we did it in our orientation, in our implicit association, whatever, where people are very comfortable expressing discomfort or racism to Muslims and Arabs. What can we do to literally combat that on like a Linda's Rasul style, on the ground? It's very action item oriented. I realize not as intellectual as what was discussed, but
Any others? Okay, I think those are great questions to.
I'll just give a quick note on the last question, and you can go to the other ones. But I'm always remembered by by Plessy v. Ferguson, not Plessy v. Ferguson, sorry, Brown v. Board, where the court said, lots of white Americans are really uncomfortable with sitting by a black person. Too bad, right? Too bad. You know what? Get over it. And I know that's kind of simplistic, but the reality is 50 years ago, sitting by a black person made the majority of white people in this country very uncomfortable. They were suspicious, they were scared, all that stuff. And the reality is,
That's not true. I have to question that as someone who's lived 50 years ago. I don't know about the South, but I have to really question that about LA. That's all I can say. It's still true today.
it's a good
all right.
qualifier. I don't know about stuff.
Does that mean, there was some segment of white people, a significant portion, enough so that the laws have been set up in a way that, in fact, you could ban black people from sitting next to white people in actually the majority of the country. And I would note, actually, in Southern California, where until the 1950s, Latinos couldn't even swim in the same pools as white people.
Neither could Jews.
Neither could Jews.
I understand that, absolutely, absolutely, and that's a problem too, but I do think that speaks to a certain kind of discomfort with people of other colors or other identities, including individuals who are Jewish, including other individuals who are Latino. But the point remains the same, that that there was discomfort, and the court said, you know what, if you don't, this is America, you don't put the badge of inferiority on people. You don't stigmatize them by creating them, calling them the other. And if it makes people uncomfortable, what we need is more, people just simply saying, you know what, I'm going to sit by you. And that's why you don't kick people off planes, because they look funny. It makes people uncomfortable. So what? Lots of people should make it uncomfortable. That's why we have First Amendment. Speech is sometimes uncomfortable. Sometimes sitting by someone who looks different is uncomfortable. But you deal with that, because that's one of the great things about this country.
Okay. So a couple things. I guess I'll maybe try to answer some of you, but I'll try and forgive me for the brevity of the conversation. The questions are really good, and I wish I had more time. As far as thinking globally, absolutely. Again, we can go outside the U.S. to, for example, Europe, and you begin to see how, in many ways, more directly than the United States even, anti-Muslim sentiment is driving kind of the undermining of even Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, and these are leftist parties that are seeking to emerge and gain power, right? But if you look at the anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant xenophobia in Germany, in France, in England, in the Netherlands, I mean, Europe is rife with anti-Muslim sentiment that's driving kind of state policy and how the EU sees itself, right? But even if you go to the so-called Middle East and South Asia, they've also bought into, in many ways, many of those states have bought into the logic of the Muslim terrorists and securitizing their borders. Of course, many of them are client states of the U.S., right? Right? And even if they maybe aren't, they're seeking to use the logic and narrative of security and terror. So I'm suggesting that, yes, this is a global idea. The notion of the Muslim as this kind of global other, the terrorist as this thing that can lubricate and legitimize different state policies is clearly, to me, evident in that play. Right? And there's much more nuance I can give, so forgive me for that. As far as your question on the work that you're doing and negotiating the hyphen, I mean, I think this is important, you know, and to go back to Europe, when I'm able to travel to Europe and, you know, visit my friends, especially in London, it's very evident to people in Europe, particularly in Britain, we're colonial subjects. If you're Pakistani, if you're Bangladeshi, if you're Jamaican, if you're Nigerian, you know you're a colonial subject. The Brits don't hide the fact that they were an empire or that they're maybe still trying to be one, right? They don't make any bones about it. And so those who were subjects of the empire, they see, we're subjects of the empire. I'm a colonial subject. In the U.S. context, because of Lady Liberty and the narrative of immigration and honorary whiteness, we're just happy to be here, right? It's better than our homeland. That's why our parents came here. This is the land of opportunity. So we don't see ourselves as colonial subjects. We might want to ask our question, why did we have to migrate? Why did we have to leave? What happened to our countries back over there? Who did it to us? What was responsible? Maybe it was centuries of colonialism. Maybe it was contemporary imperialism and war. And if we understand that, then we might see ourselves as a colonial subject. And then we might see ourselves as subject to white supremacy. So I think that there's a different way in which we have to understand our historical moment, right? We can't be prisoners of the present. We have to understand that we came from somewhere, literally and ideologically, right? We came, and what was that, right, when it comes to navigating this hyphen? Because to me, I think the hyphen, to me, is too much about liberal multiculturalism. I'm Iranian American, I'm Pakistani American, I'm this American. F that, right? You're a race body in America. This liberal multiculturalism model won't work as long as white supremacy is around. Liberal multiculturalism is really the scandal that white supremacy uses to manage diversity. It's not about undoing white supremacy, it's about including more voices at the table that they deem acceptable, right? But maintaining the structure of white supremacy. So I'll close that.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that if you have questions, the panelists would be welcome to speaking with you. And I really want to thank again all the organizers at Critical Race Studies at UCLA for putting together this panel. And feel free to come up. Thank you.
Good job.